Whenever you ask someone about API testing, how to learn API testing, the first thing you're going to hear is Postman. Everybody's going to tell you about Postman, even AI sometimes. But Postman is not the whole picture. Postman is just one tool in the API testing world. So I really want you to not think about Postman when you're thinking about API testing. And in this course, or in this video, I'm going to go through the different steps you have to go through to have a comprehensive API testing skills, right? From the basics to all the way to using AI. That's the goal of this video, to give you a roadmap or a breakdown of what are the steps in API testing, what it means, what are the things you need to consider. So I'll go over those points, and to practice everything we talked about here, I'll give you this app. I have this app. This is the front end. You shouldn't care for this video, but this front end of the app has a backend. It has an API, a RESTful API. So I'll give you the code for this application so you can practice what I'm talking about here. So it's a really good API that I use to build my API testing course. I just published a full course for API testing. I also have a portfolio project where we build the project from scratch to end, front end, back end, CI/CD, everything. So I definitely want you to check that out. So I'll give you the code for here. It's just a GitHub link. You'll find it in the description. So, and we're also going to use it in this video to demonstrate some of these concepts. So when you're talking about API testing, what are you talking about, right? Whether it's manual or automation, mostly for automation, but the whole concept is both if you're doing manual testing of APIs or automation testing of APIs. So the first thing you have to do is, of course, you have to know API basics. If you're doing testing, you probably already know API basics. If you do, you can just keep going. I'm going to break down each of those points. So you learn the basics, then Postman is in the picture now. You use Postman or Swagger. This is Swagger here. It's a UI that comes with the API that you can use to make API calls. We're going to use it in a minute. Then you talk about test design. You think about test design, how to design your test. Then you think about how do you automate this to make it repeatable. Then you think about SQL. SQL is another skill set you're going to have. Database verification. I'll explain why we need that. Then you got to talk about reports. Every time you run a test, you need a report. Then you think about CI/CD. CI/CD is really important because you write the test, it has to go somewhere. Then you talk about AI workflow. How do you use AI in this entire process? It's going to give you superpowers, right? So those are each of the stages. You can't just jump into Postman and say, hey, I know API testing or I know automation. That's just one piece of the entire puzzle. Okay, so let's dive right into it, right? So the first thing you need to know is, just the basics of APIs. What is an API? If you haven't done so already, you're going to do a little bit of research. You can go to YouTube, just look at a couple of videos, or you can go to ChatGPT of any of your favorite AIs and ask it to break it down for you. What does an API look like? What are the components, right? What is the anatomy of an API? But basically, it's two different softwares talking to each other. In our example here in this app, the front end is talking to the back end. Basically, this app is to track job application. When you're going through and filling out applications, you want to check the status of your applications. You can just keep track of it. It's a little Kanban board. But the front end is making API calls for the back end to keep track of things. All this lives in a database, and the front end gets that information using the API. So the front end is one software, the back end is another software. Is a communication between the two. But it can be two back end softwares talking to each other too. Either way, it is two different softwares making a request and a response. One software is asking for something, the other software is responding with something. So you have to understand what that looks like. What are the things that communication is composed of? They have request methods, post, get, put, delete type of thing. You have headers, you have body. When it comes to the response, pretty much same thing. You have a response body, you have headers, you have a status code that you check. Every time you make an API call, you get a response. The first thing you check is there's a code that comes with it that will tell you, hey, this API was successful or it was not, okay? So you have to understand what an API is to even start to test it. You have to know what something is so you can test if it's working properly or not, okay? So the next thing is, once you understand what an API is, how it works, then you have to start thinking about testing, designing your tests. What am I testing about this particular API? If I have an API doing a certain things, what are my tests? So usually you have different types of tests. Most of your tests are going to be positive tests, making sure it's doing what it's supposed to do. So that's called a positive test, right? An API is supposed to do something. When you send a request in a certain way, it should respond in a certain way. That is a positive thing. When I do this, it should do that. That's exactly what it's supposed to do. Then you document those things. You come up with ideas like, okay, this is what I'm testing for. Then the next type is you have to always think about negative test cases. What if I make the request in an unexpected way, right? Try to break it. Like as a QA, that's really what you're doing. So you send a request with bad data. You send a request with invalid data. Like you just make a request in an unexpected way, and the API should respond in a specific way. If a field is missing, it should tell you a field is missing, depending on how it was designed. But you just want to make sure the API is just not doing weird stuff. It's not crashing the application, or it's not blowing up. You definitely have to think about, okay, how am I going to break it? The API expects ABC. I'm going to send XYZ and see what happens. Right? Then authentication. So if an API requires some credentials, not anybody can just hit it. So this API that I'm going to talk about in a little bit. Some of the APIs are like public. You don't need authentication, but most of them, as you can see, there's a log icon here. That means you have to log in. So you're going to have to log in, and part of your test is going to be that. Like, what if a user trying to access this API without logging in? What type of login is it allowed? What kind of credentials are allowed? Which API is allowed for what user? Things like that. So you think about testing that API for authentication, right? Auth is for authentication. Then data comes, it can be between positive and negative test cases, but you can also think about like sending a lot of data. What kind of data am I sending? Things that the API is not giving you, information the API is not giving you, but it's happening in the backend. It might be creating data. A lot of times you make a request, you get a response, you check the response, but sometimes that request might be doing a bunch of things in the backend, and you might need to go check. So that you have to learn how the API works. So you will think about 4 of those things. So I can show you quick negative test cases or how to use this Swagger. If you have this Swagger here, the first thing you want to do is log in. So this is 2 repositories here. So you have the application itself, job tracker app for testing, right? This is again a real application that I built for my portfolio project for my students. And then I build an API testing automation with Python, API automation with Python using this. So this is not just a dummy thing. It's a really good project for you to practice with. Okay. So this app, I made it very easy to run. It's a Python fast API backend and Next.js frontend, but you don't need the frontend if you're just doing the backend. I made it so that you just run the backend and the backend will serve the frontend. Literally, if you just come down here, first, of course, clone it, right? You come down here and you just go to the table of content. I think I moved too fast. You just say how to run the app. You literally run one file. If you want a Mac, the .sh file. If you're on a Windows, you can do .bat or .ps1, whatever you like to use. If you use CMD or if you use PowerShell. But literally with one command, it will run. If you have any issues, then you just go through each of you run it one step at a time, okay? Very easy app. If you want to see the automation test, I will also put this in the description. This is literally the code in my code. We run automation, like a bunch of automated tests that you can just execute. I'm not done doing the README. You'll see a professional README here showing you how to run the test. So you can just run automated tests on your machine. So once you run the app, the actual software, the actual application, once you run it, you'll get this. It's going to run exactly in this port. 3050. You go to the docs, you get the Swagger, and you're going to log in. The first thing you want to do is you want to log in. So you're going to go to users, application, Auth. Where is Auth? Right here, or login. So we're going to in Swagger, you can literally test the API here. So I'm going to do try it now. When I do try it now, there's a sample user. So when I create the application, I already put a sample user in the database. It's a SQLite database. The database itself lives with code. Not typical, but in this case, very small. So I decided to do it. So if I hit execute, this is going to log in. I just logged in. I'm going to take this token here, all right? And I'm going to click on authorize. I'm just going to put the token right there and authorize, right? Just take it easy. If this is confusing, just slow it down. It's literally one command, copy it's kind of like a password, and log in. Now I'm logged in. There's pretty much, if we look at all the icons here, they're darker and they're locked now. That means I have access, okay? So if you're thinking about negative test case, I just want to show you what negative test case is. Let's look at a negative test case for a missing field. So here, I'll come here and I'm going to do this application, creating applications in the dashboard. You see how the dashboard is to keep track of applications. So I'm going to say create an application. I'm doing the post call. I'm going to click on, you can look at the schema here. It will tell you what's required. You can see that company name is required because you see if, let me make it bigger. You see the stars, that means it's required. So if I click on try it now, let me see. Yeah, I see try now and edit value. So I make this API call. Let me make it small now. I'll get rid of the required field and I hit execute, and this actually failed, right? So this is one really critical test case that you can do. I'm getting too much into the detail now, but I just want to show you an example of how you're going to use this application, right? I literally just made a manual test. I made an API call with a missing field, and I verified. I get a 422 status code and an error message with the correct body. Okay, so I just wanted to show you the app, how to use it. I just want to interject that in the middle. Now, after you have you design your tests, what kind of tests you're going to write. The next thing is you have to think about automating them. So automation, now this is when it gets bigger. You have a lot of different options depending on how small the API is. If it's a very small API, Postman itself allows you to automate things. So Postman is not mainly an automation tool, but I mean, you can debate about that. But it will allow you. You can write JavaScript code, especially now Postman have grown a lot. There's a lot of AI features inside of Postman. There's a lot of things even I need to explore, but you can definitely automate inside of Postman, but that's just going to do request, response, request, response. In the real world, you do a lot more than that. You chain your APIs. You make an API call. Let's say it's an e-commerce. API call to create a user, API call to create a product, API call to create a coupon. Then you take all that information and you make an API call to create an order. Then you make another API call to do a refund. So it's a chain thing. So you need a framework. Postman can probably handle that, but it's going to be a lot more complicated. And most companies, big companies at least, you're going to see a framework with some kind of language, right? My current job, I have a Java with rest assured. Most of my project in my previous job is Python with PyTest or Python with robot framework. So you're going to have some kind of tool. PyTest is the most popular one. I built a course in PyTest, and I do recommend PyTest for most people because that's just the most popular one. Then the automation, your Python code. So if you're doing PyTest, it's Python. It's doing basically this stuff here. It's going to create a client. It's going to make a request, a response. It just checks. Literally what we did here. What did I do? I make sure I log in and I click on. I made a request. I got a response. I verified it. That's what the automation is doing. Instead of you manually doing it, you code it once. So the automation will make a call, you get a response, check the response is correct. Now it takes time to code that, right? It takes you have to invest upfront time to code it, but then every day you can test it over and over again. And what happens is you're going to have tons of APIs. There's no way you're going to be able to test everything every day. But if you automate it, that's the whole point of automation is you can focus on testing the new stuff that just got created. The old stuff is already automated, so you can make sure the new stuff did not break the old stuff by running your automation. That is really the key thing about automation is regression. Regression is when you break stuff that already existed because you added something new. So you always have to think about automation, in the job market for automation is much, much bigger than the manual. Even though manual, everything we have talked about so far, manual testers do. You definitely test it either using a Swagger like we just did. We literally just executed a manual test, or using Postman. Manual testers absolutely do that. Okay. Then the next thing really critical that I want to mention is SQL. If you're thinking about API testing, you always have to think about SQL. Databases, they will come in the picture. So SQL is structured query language. It's the language of the database, right? That's how we talk to database. That's how we read data. We read and write data from the database. So a lot of times you make an API call gives you a response, and you check if the response is correct. You also make another API call to get the information. So in this API, for example, let's say I'm testing this create an application endpoint, right? I make an API call, I get a response that says create an application. In the response, I can make sure everything is good. The status code, the response body, everything is good. But I also want to make sure the job is created. So I'm going to make another API call that says get. First I say post saying create an API, a job. I'm going to say get it to make sure it actually did it, right? So usually you will test that way if you have that option, but a lot of times you don't have an option. In this particular example, there is a table called audit logs, right? So every time you create an API, an application, it logs it in there. And that's part of the requirement for the application, but there is no API to give you audit logs. So your only way is to go use SQL straight in the database, right? Since you know the application is doing audit logs, but you don't have an API to tell you if the audit log actually happened or not, you have to go to the database, the source of truths, using SQL. So as part of your journey, you're going to have to learn SQL. But the good news is you need like the very, very basic. You just need to know how to read a database and how to write a database. And I have a whole SQL tutorial right here on YouTube on my channel. You can just check it out. Definitely, it is part of your journey. So if anybody tells you with API testing, all you do is just make API call, get a response and verify, tell them no way, right? That's most of the time, but that's not always the case. For me, most of my experience, in fact, has been I have to go to the database and validate because it's all internal APIs I was doing. It does something. It doesn't necessarily bring me information. It will just trigger a job or create some data or something. So I have to go to the database and verify. So SQL was a big part of my experience. Okay, so database is in the picture. Then AI, and today, in today's automation, today's engineering, you cannot ignore AI in your testing. Whatever you're doing Selenium testing, Playwright testing, API testing, AI is a big part of it. How do you use it? It's obvious, right? Every step that we talked about right now, AI is going to be in the picture. You define the scenarios, coming up with test cases. It goes back to where positive test case, negative test case, authentication. You're just going to have the AI should know. Like, it all depends. You might have to explain to the AI what the API is. You might have to give it documentation. If you have a Swagger like this, there is this open API JSON. This JSON here is basically all the information about that API. You can give this to your AI agent, right? Whatever you're using, Copilot or Codex or Claude, you can just give this. If you give it this, it knows everything about the API, how the API works. So it can create scenarios for you, what kind of test to write. Then to actually write the code, you definitely have to review it. Absolutely have to review it because it does the dumbest thing. AI always likes to take the path of least resistance. It always want to do the easy thing. So if the API is giving you a bad thing, it's going to write the test for the bad thing. Oh, it's going to be like, oh, the API is saying ABC. It's going to be like, okay, let me say ABC is a pass. Like, it's just mind-boggling sometimes. As smart as it is, it's also really dumb. So you have to review it a lot. You have to review it a lot, and then every other step, review it, have it fix it, and just in a cycle. It's literally a cycle. Every time you tell it to review it, it's going to find something. So I don't have to get into the AI part, but it's basically every step you just have AI assist you. Don't assume AI is going to do it for you. So far, I built an entire SaaS, like an entire SaaS with 300 something front-end test, 1,000 back-end test. The AI is assisting me. It's not doing it. Like if I let the AI just go by itself, it's going to go rogue. Trust me, I've tried. You really have to review. You don't have to go read every code for the application, but for the test, you do. Because if the application is broken, not a big deal. If the test is broken, you will never find out. So if the application is broken, but if you have a good test, you will always catch it, right? Well, always being subjective. All right, so that's pretty much it, really. Those are the steps. I'm going to go back here. I really want you to practice. This is the flow I want you to think about. Go ahead and download this application and practice with it. If you're taking an API testing course somewhere else or anything, you can use this API. But if you want to check me out, check out my course, check out my program. It's at supersqa.com. And especially the project I'm working on right now is pretty nice because you're going to experience SDLC, software development lifecycle. That's my goal, is to basically record myself, build everything from scratch, from coming up with ideas and design to testing, implementing, deploying, rent a server, create a CI/CD, use IAC, infrastructure as code, performance testing, basically everything a software engineer in test, SDET, like me, would do. I'm trying to give my users experience. So check out that program. As part of that program, you have API testing course, a full API testing course. I'm not even done recording it, and it's 15 hours already. Very much detailed, and this is the API we use. Check me out. If you have any questions, let me know. If you want to see something different or anything, put it in the comments, all right? So I'll see you on the next one.